Okay, so what I want to do is begin by recapping just some of the material from Chisholm to help set up what Frankfurt is going to be doing here. Um, so I gave you this example in the last lecture to try and help motivate why Chisholm was positing this notion of agent causation, right? Because it's kind of an odd notion. It's sort of hard to, it's abstract. It's a little difficult to make sense of what he's talking about. But I think there's some good reasons for Chisholm thinking that we need to give some kind of account like that. So this is the example I gave in the last lecture. Suppose you have a friend who borrows $100 from you and promises to pay it back. Of course, they fail to pay you back, so they break their promise. And the question I asked is, from your perspective, if you're the one who has lent out the $100, how are you going to think about this? It seems like if we just have a conception of event causation and we think about it in that way, then the way in which we're thinking about what happens is invoking an agent there is sort of superfluous, right? Because I can see that the person who has broken their promise to me, that all of their actions are determined by prior antecedent events, which determined that they were going to do exactly what it was they were going to do. So in other words, if I try to analyze that situation from the perspective of just event causation, then it looks like referring to the agent there isn't really actually all that important, right? The agent is just one other node in this causal network, and it has no more or less importance than any other node. So it's not really necessary to refer to any sort of sense of genuine agency on that way of looking at things. Chisholm's worry there, though, is that that's not the way in which we actually experience the world. That's not the way in which we actually experience the human world. When we're interacting with each other and somebody breaks their promise to me, I think that they ought to have kept their promise, right? If somebody makes me a promise, I expect them to keep it under sort of normal circumstances. And when I do that, I think that there is a genuine sense of agency that some other person exercises, that they have a choice about whether they're going to keep their promise or not keep their promise. And that's the way in which we really do seem to experience the human world, right? The way in which we engage in the world is usually not from the perspective of event causation, right? We don't just think about other people's actions as being entirely determined and they have no say in the matter about what they do. All that's an illusion. That's not the way in which we experience it, right? We experience this sense of genuine agency, of genuine human freedom. And what Chisholm wants to say is that if we don't bring in a conception of agent causation, then we have to admit that that experience of human freedom is really just an illusion, that things really can be boiled down to this perspective of event causation, that things are all determined by prior antecedent events. And Chisholm says, and look, that's not acceptable, right? We need to preserve the sense of freedom that we do really enjoy. And he thinks that agent causation is the best way of accounting, of giving an explanation for the kind of freedom that we do enjoy. Now, the worry that many philosophers have with Chisholm's view is that, well, if we bring in that notion of agent causation, it implies a kind of a mysterious picture of what the agent is, right? So if we're saying, look, we've got to give an explanation of the human freedom that we do enjoy, and the only way of doing that is by positing this notion of agent causation, well, now we have to explain what's going on with this agent, right? This agent who seems to stand outside of the causal order of the world. And it seems like Chisholm has in mind that the agent is some kind of non-physical, non-material mind or soul that's capable of causing changes to the causal order, but is not him or herself caused in any way. So this agent becomes an uncaused cause. And it's not entirely clear how this works, right? So how does the agent sort of bob into the causal order? How is it that this agent is not affected by any sort of prior causes? Everything looks a little bit mysterious there on Chisholm's view. But remember there, the goal is to give an account of human freedom, of the type of human freedom that we do in fact enjoy. So now as we move into Frankfurt, Frankfurt agrees with that. Like there really is something to the type of freedom and moral responsibility that you and I exercise. Um, but Frankfurt thinks we can account for that. We can make sense of that, give an explanation of how that works without having to make these far-reaching assumptions about the nature of the agent. In fact, what Frankfurt is going to say is that a view of just straight up determinism is compatible with a notion of moral responsibility or human freedom, that we can make sense of them together. So we don't have to posit an agent that stands outside of the causal order, which isn't determined by any prior causes to make sense of the human world. We don't have to have that metaphysical conception of the agent that Chisholm has in order to be able to give an account of moral responsibility and human freedom, right? So that's what Frankfurt is up to. He's going to try and say, yeah, we can account for human freedom, and we don't have to make these far-reaching assumptions about the nature of the self or the agent. Okay, so let's turn to Frankfurt then. And the first thing that Frankfurt does is he just, tells us, it's kind of nice, he tells us straight up what his argument is, and then he spends the rest of the article unpacking that argument. And he begins with what he calls the principle of alternate possibilities, or what he calls PAP for short, PAP. And this is just the view that we encountered at the beginning of Chisholm, where Chisholm was giving his definition of what moral responsibility is, right? And Chisholm said that to be morally responsible, you need to have been able to have done otherwise in a given circumstance, right? So that's the principle of alternate possibilities. A person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. So if we think back to the case of Agent X shooting Agent Y, we wanted to say Agent X is in fact responsible for shooting Y just in case Agent X could have chosen not to have shot Agent Y, right? That there was this genuine choice on Agent X's part that he could have made in that circumstances, that he could have done otherwise than what he did do. And it seems like we need that choice, right? We need that openness to a genuine decision in order to really be able to hold somebody responsible for what they've done. So that's the principle of alternate possibilities. Many have accepted this as true. Having been able to do otherwise is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. So you don't get moral responsibility without having the capacity to do otherwise. That's the principle. And Frankfurt points out that many people have thought, and Chisholm included, that this entails that moral responsibility and determinism are incompatible, right? So if we think back to Chisholm's discussion of determinism, Chisholm said, well, look, if we think that being able to do otherwise is necessary for moral responsibility, well, the view of determinism says that nobody really has the capacity to do otherwise, right? If every action that I undertake is determined by some prior event or state of affairs, then I could only do exactly what it was that I was going to do. There is no genuine sense in which I could have done otherwise. And so if determinism is true and I couldn't have done otherwise than what it was I did do, then I can't be held morally responsible for what I've done, because moral responsibility entails the capacity to have done otherwise, right? So that's the view that Chisholm was initially setting up and pointing out the problem between determinism and moral responsibility, or determinism and freedom. So Frankfurt is just pointing that out. Like, many people have thought that that's the case. But Frankfurt thinks that that's false. That's not right. And the way in which Frankfurt wants to make that case is by arguing that this principle, the principle of alternate possibilities, is false. So just again, the principle is that a person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise. Frankfurt is arguing that that's not true. He writes, a person may well be morally responsible for what he has done, even though he could not have done otherwise. Right? So Frankfurt wants to argue that having been able to do otherwise is not, in fact, a necessary condition for moral responsibility. That you can be morally responsible for your actions, in some sense be said to have been free in your action, even if you couldn't do otherwise than what it was you did in fact do. Okay? So you can already see the beginnings of a compatibilist position here. We looked at, I think, a kind of bad argument for compatibilism last Tuesday, but Frankfurt is going to give us another way of thinking about compatibilism here. That there maybe is a sense in which we are determined to do exactly what it is that we're going to do. There is a sense in which determinism is true, right? A strong sense in which determinism is true. But we can still account for the freedom of human agents, in particular, holding agents morally responsible for what they've done, and hold that determinism is true at the same time, that we couldn't do otherwise than what it was that we did do. Okay. So one can be morally responsible for Frankfurt, even if they couldn't have done otherwise. Now, the trick for this paper is figuring out how that works, right? So this is the overview of the general terrain, and now we have to get into the nitty-gritty and see what the argument is and why Frankfurt thinks that this is the kind of view we should adopt. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so let's start to unpack Frankfurt's argument then. The first thing that Frankfurt is going to note here is that this principle of alternate possibilities, that a person is morally responsible for what he has done only if he could have done otherwise, is often exemplified in cases of coercion. So cases of coercion seem to be clear examples of this more general principle of alternate possibilities, right? So what does Frankfurt mean by this? Well, we've looked at a number of cases where a person is just coerced or forced into an action, right? So we looked at that case of Agent X shooting Agent Y, and we imagined this possibility that we had a mysterious person who was controlling Agent X's actions. Maybe they put them under a hypnotic spell or inject them with some kind of murderous serum, which is going to lead them to shoot Agent Y. That's a case of coercion. That's a case where you have somebody stepping in and forcing you to engage in a given action, right? So if somebody forces you to do something and there's no way out of it, it looks like you don't have any choice but to do the thing that you're being compelled to do. And that looks like a case, a particular case of the principle of alternate possibilities. Cases of coercion offer us circumstances that are sufficient for causing a person to do something they could not have otherwise avoided doing, right? So if we think that Agent X has been injected with a murderous serum, for instance, which leads him to shoot Agent Y, then Agent X can't help but do what it is that he's going to do. And in such a case where we say Agent X is coerced, we don't want to hold Agent X morally responsible, right? Because we're saying he couldn't do anything other than what it was he did in fact do. He was forced to do it. He didn't have any choice in the matter. So cases of coercion where somebody is forced into an action seem to be clear cases in which the person isn't morally responsible for what they've done. In fact, we often excuse people for doing otherwise horrendous things if they were coerced, if they were forced into the action against their will, we say, right? And we say, well, that excuses them because they couldn't do other than they did do. So, so coercion seems to be a particularized version of the principle of alternate possibilities. Now, Frankfurt has a task on his hand, right? Because he thinks this principle isn't true, right? He thinks that a person can be morally responsible even if they couldn't do otherwise. And if he can show, this is sort of going to be his strategy here, if he can show that cases of coercion can be compatible with moral responsibility, then we'll have some reasons for thinking that PAP is not always true, right? So if he can show a case in which somebody is coerced into an action, but they're still morally responsible for what they've done, that would be an instance in which you have somebody being held morally responsible, even though they couldn't have done otherwise. And what Frankfurt is going to try and do is show us some cases where he thinks that we'll be able to see that that's the case. Somebody can't do otherwise, but they're still morally responsible. And he's going to say that's some reason for thinking that the principle is false. I'm going to lay this out abstractly right now, and then we'll start looking at the case in particular that Chisholm, sorry, I keep getting those mixed up, that Frankfurt has in mind, and we'll break it down in more particular detail. So what Frankfurt thinks is that there may be circumstances that would compel a person to action if those circumstances were fulfilled, but that do not actually compel the person to action. There may be circumstances in which a person decides to engage in some action, but if they didn't make that decision, they would have been compelled to the action anyways, right? So what Frankfurt is going to try and do is imagine a case in which somebody decides to do something on their own, of their own choice, right? We'll use choice loosely there. Just they make the decision to engage in some act. And what Frankfurt is going to try and imagine is a case in which that happens, but if they didn't make that decision, they would have been compelled to engage in that act anyways. That's the general structure of the type of example that Frankfurt wants to consider here. And what we'll do now is try and fill that out and see what that looks like with some more detail. Okay, good. Questions, comments? Okay, so these examples are kind of fun. So Frankfurt has us imagine the case of Jones. This is his protagonist for his thought experiments here. Jones decides for reasons of his own to do something. Then someone threatens him to do precisely that thing that he had already decided to do, and then Jones goes ahead and does it. Okay, that's the general structure of the type of example that Frankfurt is working with here. And I'm just going to fill it in further. Frankfurt doesn't give us this particular example, but I'm just filling this in to help us get some more sort of visual, pictorial imagery to work with here. So let's say Jones decides to rob a bank. What Jones' motives are, not entirely clear, but let's just say Jones is, he needs the extra money, let's say, to take care of his family. He's fallen on very hard times, and he's like, okay, well, if I rob the bank, then I'll have the money, I'll be able to take care of my family. We don't know if Jones is sort of morally upright or not, but this is sort of the general reasoning behind his decision here. So let's just throw in the Reservoir Dogs reference there, right? So Jones decides to rob a bank, and this is he engages in this decision on his own, right? He comes up with this idea on his own and he decides to do it. Now, what happens next is somebody comes along and says to Jones, Jones, if you don't rob the bank, I'm going to do something horrible to you. So I've got to think of something horrible. It's not the most pleasant thing, but whatever, just fill in the details, right? He says, I'm going to burn down your house with your family in it. Right? So a very serious threat. Just imagine some serious threat which is made to Jones. So this person comes along and says, Jones, if you don't rob the bank, I'm going to burn down your house with your family in it. Okay. So Jones has decided for reasons of his own to rob the bank. Someone comes along, issues this serious threat, says, if you don't rob the bank, I'm going to do this horrible thing. And Jones goes and robs the bank. Okay. Now, a question to ask here is, has Jones been coerced? Number one. And the second question is Jones morally responsible for what he's done? What do you think? Any initial thoughts here? Is he coerced? Has he been coerced? Has he been forced to rob the bank? Going once, going twice? No
Well, he
thoughts?
wanted to do it anyways.
Right. So he wanted to do it. He decided to do it on his own. And then the threat was issued. So you might think, well, if he decided on his own, that seems like there is maybe not entirely coerced. Frankfurt thinks, well, at this point, the case is underdetermined. What we mean when we say underdetermined is that there's not enough details here yet to figure out if he's been coerced or if he's morally responsible, right? Because we don't actually know, is when he actually goes to rob the bank, is he acting on the basis of his decision or is he acting on the basis of the threat? And whether or not he's acting on his own or on the basis of the threat seems to be relevant in determining whether or not he's coerced and morally responsible for what he's done, right? So what Frankfurt says is we've got to fill in the details a little bit further. And what Frankfurt is going to do now is give us 3 different cases of Jones. 3 different ways of filling in the details, and we'll ask this question for each. Has Jones been coerced, and is Jones morally responsible? Okay, so I have a J1 here just for Jones 1. The way in which Frankfurt lays it out in the paper is Jones subscript 1, right? So when I have J1 here, it just refers to the first case of Jones. Okay, so this is the example that Frankfurt has us consider. Let's say that Jones is not a reasonable person, right? And Jones, whenever Jones makes up his mind to do something, he does it, no matter what. Whether or not it is ultimately a good idea or a bad idea, whether or not he's getting information from other people that maybe he shouldn't go through with it, when he makes up his mind to do something, he does it no matter what the cost. Okay? So in this case, Jones decides to rob the bank, and since he's already decided to do it, there's nothing which is going to change his mind. Now, the person comes to Jones with the threat and says, Jones, if you don't rob the bank, I'm going to do this horrible thing. But Jones isn't a reasonable person, right? And he's already decided that he's going to rob the bank. So in that case, the threat has no effective force. It doesn't do anything, right? It's sort of an empty threat because that's maybe not the best way to put it. It just has no effective force because Jones has already decided to do the thing and there's nothing that's going to change his mind. Okay. So that's the first case. Do we want to say Jones is coerced in this instance? 1, and 2, is Jones morally responsible? He seems to have been able to, he made the decision on his own. He wasn't forced into the decision by somebody else, at least, right? So let's say then that he's not coerced. Is he morally responsible? So not coerced, but is Jones, would you say Jones is morally responsible for what he's done? in this case, where Jones is the unreasonable man.
Depends on why he's not a reasonable man. Does he
Uh,
have a brain tumor that makes him do
right.
whatever he wants
No,
whenever he
let's
wants?
very, very good, very good. Yeah. So let's just say we're not like causal, like hardcore causal determinists at this point, and so we're just looking at this from the normal human perspective, and let's also posit that Jones one doesn't have, he's not mentally ill. He's not suffering from like severe addiction. He doesn't have any medical issues that are leading to abnormalities in behavior. He's just an unreasonable person, and there's no a sort of medical condition which is leading to this, right? So a normal case of an unreasonable person, right? And it looks like in a case like that, we, just from our ordinary perspective, we hold this person responsible for what they've done, right? No brain tumors, no medical abnormalities or anything like that. So it looks like in this case of Jones 1, he's not coerced and he is morally responsible, right? Even though this threat came along, he acted on the basis of his prior decision. Nothing was going to change his mind. So it's not coerced. And since he acted on his own, most of us would want to say he is morally responsible. He wasn't coerced. Um, and and so it looks like from the ordinary perspective that he had a choice, right? He could have decided not to, even though he's an unreasonable person. He could have decided not to rob the bank. And this is an instance of the principle of alternate possibilities, right? Because since he's not coerced, he could have done otherwise. And that ability to have done otherwise would lead us to say that he's morally responsible for his action. Again, I was sort of leaving out the hard causal determinist view at this point, and you'll see why in just a minute. Okay, so that's the first case. Now, the second case that Frankfurt considers, this is the case of Jones 2, right? So Jones version 2. And in this case, Jones 2 is, let's say, a little bit of a coward. And he's overwhelmed by the threat. The threat is terrifying to Jones 2. He's absolutely terrified by it and bowled over by the threat. And he had come up with the decision earlier on that he was going to go rob the bank. But now when the threat is issued, he completely forgets his previous reasons for wanting to rob the bank, and he acts solely on the basis of the threat. So now the reason that Jones 2 is robbing the bank is because of the threat that has been made, of this very serious threat. Would we say that Jones 2 has been coerced?
I would say so.
Okay.
Because if the previous reasons um, don't matter to him, and it was only because he was overwhelmed by the threat, then I would say he was coerced.
Yeah. And that seems like a reasonable position to take. I mean, if we were to give an explanation of Jones 2, his behavior, we'd say, well, why did he rob the bank? It looks like in this case, the answer to that question, why did he rob the bank, is because of the threat which was made. So it looks like the threat is what's leading him to rob the bank, not his previous decision. And that would be a case of coercion. He's being coerced. So would we say he's morally responsible then? Well, if we're looking at this in terms of the principle of alternate possibilities, he's coerced. And since he's coerced, he doesn't have the ability to do otherwise. So he's not morally responsible for the action. And we think about cases where people are coerced, and we often use that as an excuse, right? Say, oh yeah, your hand was forced, right? You didn't have a choice. So Frankfurt wants to say that in the case of Jones 2 is coerced and he's not morally responsible. And that's totally compatible with the principle of alternative possibilities so far. Right? Any pushback on that one? Okay, so that's Jones 1, Jones 2. Now, here is the interesting case for Frankfurt, the case of Jones version 3. Okay, so in this instance, Jones 3 performs the action based on the decision he made prior to the threat. Right? So he robs the bank because of the decision that he made before the threat was issued. So, I want to take care of my family, etc. I'm going to rob the bank. I'm going to do this thing. Now the threat is issued. And when Jones 3 hears the threat, Jones 3 is a reasonable person. And Jones 3 takes the threat very seriously. The way in which Frankfurt puts it is that he's stampeded by the threat. So the threat is initially when it's made, it's overwhelming. And it really makes a serious impact on Jones 3. And Jones 3 says, my God, I would never, put my family in such danger. I would entirely give in to this threat if I hadn't already made this decision earlier to go forward with the action. So the threat makes a significant impact, and he would have submitted to it if he had not already made a decision earlier to do it. So do we get the scenario here? Jones 3 has decided to do the thing. The threat comes along, takes the threat very seriously, and he would give in to the threat if he had not already decided to rob the bank. So maybe he says something like, oh, well, good thing I already decided to rob the bank because I would have had to do this if I had not decided to do it. Okay, so what do we want to say in the case of Jones 3? Has Jones 3 been coerced? So you might say he's not coerced, and the reason why he's not coerced is because really the reason that he is doing this thing is the reason that he came up with, right? His own reasoning. So you might think he's not coerced in this particular situation, okay? Now let's just posit that for a moment. So if he's not coerced, normally we would say that not being coerced would mean he is morally responsible for his action, right? So are we going to say he's morally responsible here? Let's posit that. Let's say Jones 3 is not coerced and morally responsible for his actions. Okay. Well, let's think of this for a second. The principle of alternate possibilities states that a person is morally responsible for their action only if they could have done otherwise. Could Jones 3 have done otherwise in this instance? So just to recap that, right? Jones 3 makes the decision. The threat is issued. The threat is very serious, and he would succumb to the threat if he hadn't made the decision prior, but he ultimately ends up acting on his own decision. Now, the question is, could Jones in this situation have done anything other than rob the bank?
It seems like no, because
Right.
he both decided to do it and was coerced to do it in a way that made an impact.
Okay. Right. So you might say, no, he couldn't have done otherwise, because if he had decided not to rob the bank, the threat would have been effective, right? It would have led him to rob the bank. Now, it turns out that he did decide on his own to rob the bank, but if he had decided not to, he would have still robbed the bank, right? So no matter what, he's robbing the bank in the case of Jones 3. There's no other possibility. And yet it seems like since he does make the decision on his own, we want to say he's morally responsible. That means this would be an instance in which Jones 3 couldn't have done otherwise. He had to do what it was he was going to do, but he is morally responsible. That would be a counterexample to Pat. And you might suggest, even as Janie was, I think, just pointing to as well, is that, well, we would want to think of this as a case of coercion. It's a sort of a little bit stranger because the threat isn't precisely what he's acting on, but there's no way for him to get around the action, right? If he were to decide, because he doesn't have a choice now. The choice is gone since the threat is serious enough for Jones 3 to give into it, to have to give into it, in fact. So it looks like if we say he's coerced, it looks like we could say he's coerced. But even if we say he's coerced in this instance, it seems like we still want to say he's morally responsible, because the reason why he's doing what he's doing is the decision that he came to himself. So that's the case of Jones 3. And Frankfurt thinks that this is a very interesting case, because what it seems to show is that we have a case in which somebody couldn't do otherwise than what it was they did do, could be coerced or not coerced, and yet they're still morally responsible. And if that's really what's going on here, then it looks like there's some instances in which we can be morally responsible, even if we couldn't have done otherwise than what it was we did, in fact, do. So let's just break down the example here a little bit further to make sure that we're seeing it clearly. So Jones 3 performs the action based on the decision he made prior to the threat, right? It's his own decision which leads to the robbing of the bank. The threat makes a significant impact, and he would have submitted to it if he had not already made a decision earlier to do it. So Jones 3 antecedently decides to undertake the act regardless of the threat. But if he had antecedently decided not to undertake the act, the threat would have motivated him to undertake it. Therefore, no alternative, or alternate is the actual word that Frankfurt used there. I made a little slip. Therefore, no alternate possibility is open to Jones 3, since he would have been compelled to the act even if he had decided against it. So there's really only one possible course of action for Jones 3. And yet he undertakes the act on the basis of his own decision-making process. So it looks like there's no alternative possibility open to Jones 3, yet he is morally culpable. We'd say he's still responsible for what he's done, even though if he had decided otherwise, he would have still engaged in the same act. And Frankfurt is arguing that this case of Jones 3 is a counterexample to the principle of alternate possibilities, that one can be morally responsible even though they couldn't have done otherwise. And notice what Frankfurt's doing there, because if you admit that, then it looks like that opens the door for the compatibility of moral responsibility and determinism. Because we can say that a person, even though they couldn't have done otherwise because they were determined to do exactly what it was they were going to do, can still be held morally responsible for their actions. So at least the door is open now for some version of compatibilism, compatibility of moral responsibility and determinism. And we don't have to make any sort of far-reaching assumptions about non-physical agents who are uncaused causes. We just say determinism and moral responsibility are in fact compatible with each other. It's a very interesting case, and I'm going to try and break this down further to show you why we might think this is relevant to normal cases of moral responsibility. We've got a very specified case here, but what Frankfurt has done is just opened the door a little bit and shown us that maybe that principle of alternate possibilities, that somebody is morally responsible only if they could have done otherwise, isn't always true. Okay, so Frankfurt raises a possible objection here but he dismisses with this objection pretty quickly, and I think rightfully so. And the way in which he does this is, so we imagine an objection to the case of Jones 3 here and say, well, this isn't really a case of coercion because Jones 3 acted upon his earlier decision, not upon the threat, right? And that's why we can say he's morally responsible. It's because he wasn't coerced. But even if we don't think about this as a case of coercion, if he had not acted on his initial decision, then he would have still acted on the basis of the threat. So it looks like this. If we say that Jones 3 is coerced, it's a clear case of coercion being compatible with moral responsibility, right? If he's coerced, if we want to say he's coerced, then we have a case in which somebody couldn't do otherwise. They're being coerced, and yet they're still morally responsible. And if we think he isn't coerced, right? Because I think that's a reasonable intuition to have here as well, that he isn't coerced. If we think Jones 3 isn't coerced, we still have to admit that Jones 3 is responsible, even though he couldn't have done otherwise. So whether he's coerced or not is almost irrelevant at this point, because either way, Jones 3 seems morally culpable, even though he couldn't have done otherwise. So if he is coerced, still morally responsible. If he isn't coerced, still morally responsible. In both those cases, he couldn't do otherwise than what it was he did do. So it seems like a clear-cut case of moral responsibility being compatible with not having been able to do otherwise. Do you think that's right? I mean, what do you make of Frankfurt's position here? He seems to be saying that, look, we can be held morally responsible in circumstances where we didn't have any choice to do otherwise than what it was we did do. That's what the case of Jones 3 seems to represent. We might raise another objection here, okay? So let's look at another possible objection. You might say, wait, this is a little bit artificial in the sense that Jones 3 could have in fact resisted the threat. So there is a sense in which, look, Jones 3, given like his disposition, he would have acted on the threat. Like that's just how things are going to play out in this particular scenario. So there is a sense in which Jones 3 couldn't have resisted the threat and so could not do otherwise than what he did. However, it seems like just the nature of the threat that there is a possibility that Jones 3 could have not given into it, even though the consequences of doing so would have been dire, right? His house with the family burned down, right? So it seems like there is an alternate possibility open to Jones 3, even if the threat is made, because he could always decide not to act on the basis of the threat. So the possibility of Jones 3 not giving in to the threat and suffering the consequences was open to him, even though it never became and never would become an actuality. Right? Just the nature of the threat leaves open the possibility that he could have resisted. So there's some possible world in which Jones 3 resists the threat, but in no actual world that Jones 3 occupies does he do so. And if we say that there is this possibility for him to have done otherwise, then that's the reason the objection would run, that we want to say he's morally responsible, is because he really could have done otherwise in this case, even though he wouldn't in this scenario. That possibility was still open to him. Okay, so how is Frankfurt going to respond to that objection? So let's just be clear about what the objection is. It looks like in the case of Jones 3, we have a case in which Jones 3 couldn't have done otherwise, and yet is still morally responsible. And the objection is saying, no. Jones 3 could have actually not given into the threat and just suffered the terrible consequences, right? And even though he's not going to do that because he's reasonable, he will give into the threat when it's issued. That possibility is still there. And that's why we want to say that he's still morally responsible. To me, it seems like, well, no, if the threat is made, he's being coerced. He's being coerced. But Frankfurt wants to say, look, okay, so I'm just going to accept that objection and say you're right. Frankfurt thinks he can give us an even stronger case in which it's clear that the person is morally responsible even though they couldn't have done otherwise than what they did in fact do. And so this leads us to the fun case of Jones 4 and Mr. Black. Okay, so how does this scenario work? So Mr. Black is willing to go to considerable lengths to make sure that Jones 4 does what it is that he wants him to do. Okay. Mr. Black is very sophisticated, has all sorts of means to get Jones 4 to do what it is that he wants him to do. But Mr. Black doesn't want to show his cards. So he doesn't want Jones 4 to know that he's lurking there in the background, making sure that Jones 4 is going to do what it is that he wants him to do. Okay, so he doesn't want to show his cards. Now, what Mr. Black is going to do is make sure that Jones 4 does the thing that he wants him to do. And what Mr. Black wants him to do is to rob the bank. But he doesn't want to show his cards, so he wants Jones 4 to rob the bank on his own without having to intervene at all. He's ready to step in the case that Jones 4 starts to lean towards the decision of not robbing the bank. Mr. Black will step in and make sure that he does, in fact, rob the bank. But he doesn't want to have to go to those lengths to do that. But if he has to, he's got means to accomplish this. So one thing Mr. Black might do is inject Jones 4 with the hypnotic serum, let's say. That just compels Jones 4 to rob the bank. And we can actually think of any sort of scenario here that makes it so that Jones 4 can't do otherwise than what he does do. It might be a threat. It might be this hypnotic serum. We might even think of a sort of more sci-fi example where Mr. Black is actually able to monitor the neuronal firings of Jones 4. And when it becomes clear that Jones 4 is starting to make a decision to not rob the bank, he presses a button and it alters the neurochemistry of Jones 4 so that Jones 4 will then be led to the decision to rob the bank. And so we might think Mr. Black is hanging out back there. He's monitoring Jones's 4 neurochemistry. And if Jones 4 starts to go to the decision to not rob the bank, he's going to make sure he puts the right sort of chemicals in his brain to push him to rob the bank. Again, the type of scenario, we use the science fiction example, that's not entirely what's relevant here. What's relevant is that we are able to conceive of a case in which Mr. Black can make it that Jones 4 will be compelled to rob the bank. Okay, so that's the type of scenario that we're looking at here. And now what Frankfurt has us imagine is Mr. Black never does have to intervene. So Jones 4, on his own, decides to rob the bank. Now, if Jones 4 had decided not to, Mr. Black would have stepped in and made sure that he does in fact rob the bank. But he never has to step in because Jones 4 robs the bank on his own accord. Would we say in that scenario that Jones 4 is morally responsible for what he's done?
It seems effectively the same as J3.
Uh-huh. But now we have no possible way out, right? Because in the case of Jones 3, we were able to say he could have not given into the threat, right? That was the objection that we were just looking at. It's to say, no, I mean, because there's still this possibility he just accepts the horrible consequences and doesn't give into the threat. What Frankfurt is trying to show here is we're now blocking that possibility. It looks like in this case, if Jones 4 were to decide not to rob the bank, he would have to rob the bank. There's no other option in a scenario like this. Because he's doing it of his own accord, right? That's what he wants to do. He wants to rob the bank. It's his choice. Now, it looks like Jones 4 is responsible for robbing the bank, even though in the case that he had decided not to rob the bank, he would have done it anyways. So he couldn't do otherwise than what it was he did in fact do. So Frankfurt then thinks that this is a clear counterexample to the principle of alternate possibilities. Whatever Jones's 4's inclinations are, he will do the thing that Black wants him to do. Right? But Black never has to show his hand because Jones 4 is going to decide to rob the bank on his own accord. So Black never actually has to step in. So which of the actions Jones 4 performs isn't up to him. He doesn't actually have a choice about whether he robs the bank or not, because no matter what, he's going to rob the bank. If we want to say he has a choice, really the sense in which he has a choice is that it's up to him whether he acts on his own or whether he acts on the intervention of Black, because that's really what his choice would amount to, is that instead of being motivated by his own action, his own decision, he would be motivated by Black's intervention. But in either way, he's going to do that one thing. There's only one possible future for Jones 4, to rob the bank. Right? So whatever he does, it results in the same action. So Jones 4 could then never have done otherwise than what it was he did do. In some sense, he's determined to rob the bank, right? There's no other way around it. If he does the action on his own accord and not on the intervention of Black, then he seems morally culpable for what he's done, right? So he doesn't have any choice. He's determined to rob the bank, and yet we still want to say he's responsible. So why do we want to say Mr. Black is responsible? What's the reason there? Why do we feel that, why do we want to say Jones 4 is responsible? What's the reason that we have for thinking that he's responsible here? That he decided to go forward with the action, right? So let's zoom. So this is a very particular case that Frankfurt has provided us with here. But let's try and apply this to maybe normal circumstances, right? Let's say determinism is true. And what I do, I am compelled to do it. There are antecedent events which lead up to me doing what it is I'm going to do, and I can't help but do the thing that I do in fact do. On this scenario, on the kind of scenario that Frankfurt is offering us, how would we account for moral responsibility and free will on on a picture like that where determinism holds, right? So let's say determinism is true, and you are compelled to do what it is you're going to do, right? There's just, given the way in which things are at an earlier time in conjunction with the laws of nature, there's really only one physically possible future at any given moment. And Frankfurt wants to say, yeah, we can say that that's true. There's only one physically possible future at a given moment, and you're still morally responsible for what it is you do. If you're coerced, Frankfurt is actually going to agree in cases of coercion, you probably wouldn't be morally responsible, right? So let's say determinism is true. There's only one physically possible future at any given moment for you to undertake. If you're coerced, then it seems like you're acting on the basis of somebody else's decision, right? And I think, Frankfurt wants to say, yeah, in many of those cases of coercion, we want to say you're not morally responsible, right? And why do we say you're not morally responsible in those cases? Well, because you didn't make the decision, right? But what about in the cases where you're not coerced? In the cases where you're not coerced, it seems like the decision was up to you. You're the one who made the decision. So even if determinism is true, let's say, like there's only one physically possible future for you at a given moment, Frankfurt wants to say, yeah, but the relevant fact there is not determinism. The relevant fact in the case of Jones 4 is that he wanted to rob the bank. He wanted to do it. If he were just coerced, if Black came in and issued the threat and he acts on the basis of the threat, then we say not morally responsible, because you're acting on the basis of the coercion, not on your own decision. But in the case of Jones 4, it looks like he is morally responsible for what he's done because it was his choice, his decision, even though he couldn't have done otherwise than what it was he did do. Now, Frankfurt wants to apply that to the picture of human freedom more generally and say, look, yes, determinism might be true, but that's not the relevant fact when we're thinking about whether somebody's morally culpable for their action. The relevant fact is whether the person wanted to do the action that they did do. The idea is that a person's not being able to do otherwise, so a person not being able to do otherwise, that does guarantee that they will do that thing, right? If I say there's no possible way for you to do other than you did in fact do, that means that you are compelled to do the thing that you're going to do, okay? But that fact need not play a role in the explanation of why you do that thing, right? So if I say, look, determinism is true, there's only one physically possible future for you at a given moment, you can't do otherwise than what those prior causal antecedent events in conjunction with the laws of nature dictate. And that does mean that you are going to be compelled to do the thing that it is that you do in fact do. That might not be relevant in the explanation for why you did that thing. In the case of Jones 4, the relevant fact is not that Mr. Black is lurking in the background. The relevant fact is that Jones 4 decided to undertake the action. In fact, the fact that one could not have done otherwise may actually be irrelevant to the circumstances that brought about the action. In the case of Jones 4, right, we could just get rid of Mr. Black, and when we say he's morally culpable, we account for his moral culpability in terms of the decision that he made, not in terms of what Mr. Black is doing. If Mr. Black did intervene, then we would say that's a relevant fact. But it's not the relevant fact in the way in which that scenario plays out. So Jones 4 couldn't do otherwise, but that's not the relevant fact in terms of his moral culpability. The relevant fact is that he decided to do it, that he wanted to do it. So even though he couldn't do otherwise, he wanted to do it, so he's morally responsible. We can say he was free to make that choice in some sense. We'd have to qualify that notion of free there, right? Because it gets a little tricky. But nonetheless, we do want to say he's morally responsible, right? Well, Frankfurt thinks that we want to say that. Well, let's try and apply this to the case of Agent X and Agent Y, right? To go back to Chisholm's example. Well, we wanted to say that Agent X is morally responsible only if he could have done otherwise. That was the way we were first putting it last week, right? And Chisholm said, well, if determinism's true, then Agent X couldn't have done otherwise than what it was he did do. Causal antecedent events in conjunction with the laws of nature made it so that Agent X had to shoot Agent Y. And either way in which, any way in which things play out, Agent X is going to shoot Agent Y. And Chisholm said, well, if that's true, then he's not morally responsible because he couldn't have done otherwise than what it was he did do. Frankfurt is saying, no, determinism could be true. Agent X can be responsible for his action, even though causal antecedent events in conjunction with the laws of nature determine that Agent X is going to do exactly what it is he's going to do. Agent X's inability to do otherwise might play no role in the explanation of why he did it. It might not be relevant at all. And think about it. Am I going to say that the relevant facts in the case of Agent X shooting Y are the initial conditions at the beginning of the universe in conjunction with the laws of nature, right? If I'm in a court of law, am I going to point to that as the reason why we shouldn't hold Agent X morally responsible? Frankfurt says, no way. Right? The relevant explanation, let's say in this case, is the murderous desire for revenge that Agent X has. His inability to do otherwise may not be relevant at all to what he did. Even if he is determined, we say that those facts, those deterministic facts mean that he is going to do exactly what it is he's going to do. That's not what we're interested in when we're interested in moral responsibility. We're interested in whether or not Agent X wanted to shoot Agent Y. He didn't shoot Agent Y because he couldn't do otherwise. He shot Agent Y because he wanted revenge, because he wanted to shoot Agent Y. Right? If we brought in a coercive agent, remember the mysterious person who is coercing Agent X to shoot Agent Y, injects them with the hypnotic serum or however you want to parse that. And in that case, we'd say he isn't morally responsible because he didn't endorse the action. He didn't want to do it. The only relevant fact there was that he couldn't do otherwise when he's coerced like that. But in the normal case where we don't have somebody coercing him to shoot Agent Y, the relevant fact which is going to explain his behavior are the psychological motivations he has for doing it. Okay, so Jack, I sympathize with your unwillingness to go along with Frankfurt here because there is still, some worry. Because you might say, well, if you're a determinist, isn't the fact that there are these prior causes still relevant in terms of the explanation of what Jones 4 or Agent X did? Isn't that still going to play a relevant role in the explanation if we understand, the deterministic nature of the world? And so somebody who is responding to Frankfurt's example here might say, well, look, let's revise the principle of alternate possibilities. And let's restate it like this. A person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it because he could not have done otherwise. Right? Because what Frankfurt wanted to say is, the reason why Jones 4 is morally responsible is because he did it for some other reason than not being able to do otherwise. So what the objection would say is that, well, if he does it because he couldn't have done otherwise, then we can say he's morally responsible, if that's the motivating reason and not some other reason. And this wouldn't seriously affect Chisholm's contention that moral responsibility requires the capacity to have done otherwise, just generally the principle of alternate possibilities. It wouldn't affect that. Because if an action is causally determined, then it would be true that the person performed it because of those causal determinants, right? So if you're a determinist, you want to say, no, what Isabella was pointing out earlier, the Jones 4 wanted to provide for his family. Those are prior causal antecedents that he had no control over. They were determined by prior causal states, etc. So if some action is determined because of those prior causal determinants, then it will be true that the person performed the action because of those causal determinants. That will be the reason why they performed those actions. And if those prior causal determinants make it so that the person could not have done otherwise, as determinism suggests, then they will have performed the action because they could not have done otherwise. And so we could say in the case of Jones 4 that he performed the action, that the relevant, in both scenarios, the relevant reason for him performing the action is that he couldn't do otherwise. And that would fit right in with the revision here. A person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it because he could not have done otherwise. Thus, the person would not be morally responsible in such a scenario. So in the case of Jones 4, then we'd want to say, someone like Chisholm would want to say, even in the case of Jones 4 is not morally responsible even when he doesn't learn about Mr. Black. Because if we really look at the situation, we see that he has no capacity to do otherwise. He couldn't have done otherwise. And his not having been able to do otherwise is the relevant reason that brings about the event. So the idea here is that if you're a determinist, you're going to say that those causal determinants are the relevant reason that brought about the action or event. But Frankfurt thinks that the revision isn't acceptable, that this isn't, we shouldn't think of the revision in this way. Frankfurt wants to say, so if somebody says something like, I did it because I couldn't have done otherwise, right? So go back to the example of like the drug addict, for instance, and they take the next hit of their drug, and they say, I couldn't help it. I didn't want to do it, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't help but do it. I did it because I couldn't have done otherwise, or I did it because I had to. Frankfurt says when somebody says something like that, what they really mean, what they're really saying, is that they did what they did only because they were unable to do otherwise, or only because they had to. That only because is important here. So when somebody says I did it because I couldn't have done otherwise, what they really mean, according to Frankfurt, is that they did it because they had because they were unable to do anything else. That was the only reason motivating them to act. The only reason why they acted in the way that they did was because they couldn't do otherwise, or because they were forced to do it. And we understand in those cases, like the drug addict who takes the drug even though they don't want to, we understand in such cases that the person did what they did not because they wanted or chose to do it. Chose is maybe that use of chose here is a little unclear. Not because they wanted to do it, but because they had to do it. They were in some sense forced to do it. So what Frankfurt wants to say is that no, a person is morally responsible when a person is not morally responsible when what they do is only because they were unable to do otherwise. So this is Frankfurt's revised version of the principle of alternative possibilities, which he thinks is the correct version. A person is not morally responsible for what he has done if he did it only because he could not have done otherwise. Right? So again, the case of the drug addict who doesn't want to take the drug, they are engaging in the action not because they want to do it, but only because they are being compelled. And Frankfurt thinks that's going to make a difference in the way in which we evaluate that person morally. We're going to say that person wants to stop, but they can't, right? They need help. Whereas when we have a person who is taking the drug and they want to take the drug, then they're not taking the drug because they can't do otherwise. They're taking the drug because they want to do it. It's still the case that they can't do otherwise, but the relevant reason there for them taking the drug, according to Frankfurt, is that now they want to do it. They endorse it. The way in which they're relating to the event as it unfolds is different in that scenario. So a person may have been unable to do otherwise, but what accounts for whether he's morally responsible is if he performed the act for reasons other than his being unable to do otherwise. So you might think for any action we undertake, it's going to be the case that we couldn't have done otherwise than what it was we did do. But oftentimes that's not the relevant explanation in explaining what it is that we do, right? We have other reasons for acting. We want to achieve certain results. We want to advance certain plans or states of affairs. So in the case where what we do is only because we couldn't have done otherwise, those are usually like cases of extreme coercion in various forms, then we can say that a person isn't morally responsible. But in most cases, we have other reasons for doing what it is that we do, in fact, do. Often what we are interested in when it comes to moral responsibility is whether the person wanted to do what it is they did do. Right? This attitude of affirmation to the action which is undertaken. The person did what he did only because he was unable to do otherwise. That is, if he didn't do it for reasons of his own, then he's not responsible. But if he sincerely wanted to do it, even if he could not have done otherwise, he's responsible for what he has done. Oops, that's the end. So again, Frankfurt saying, look, in the case where somebody is genuinely coerced, we're not going to hold that person morally responsible because they're doing it only because they couldn't have done otherwise. But that's not the case in most situations. In most situations, when we engage in an action, even if we're determined to engage in it, we have all sorts of reasons why we are doing it. And those other reasons are very important in judging whether a person is responsible for what they've done. So that's how Frankfurt gets thinks he gets freedom here, or at least moral responsibility. And Frankfurt's clear that it may not be the case that moral responsibility and genuine freedom are as intimately tied together as the way we were previously supposing. But we do, he thinks, he does think we get moral responsibility, even if we accept a deterministic view of the world. The way in which to think about this is, so the first revision that comes up is an objection to Frankfurt. And what that states is that a person is not morally responsible if they do what they do because they couldn't have done otherwise. And what that is trying to state is that the relevant, if the relevant reason in the explanation is that the person couldn't have done otherwise, then they're not morally responsible. And of course, if you are like a hard determinist, then you think that the prior causal antecedent events which led up to that moment are relevant, right? If it even led up to your endorsing the action, those are going to be relevant factors. So in basically any case, you can say that the reason why somebody did what they did was only because because they couldn't do otherwise, right? That's the view of determinism, and that's to object to Frankfurt's case of Jones 4 and to say Jones 4 isn't morally responsible. Even though it looks like he endorses the action, he really couldn't do otherwise, and not being able to do otherwise just guarantees that you will do the thing. So the person who's objecting to Frankfurt might be saying, we'll revise this principle of alternate possibilities just to make it a little bit more explicit what we mean there. Now, Frankfurt rejects that revision, and he says, look, when somebody says, I did this because I couldn't have done otherwise, what they really mean is that I did this action only because I couldn't have done otherwise. That this not have being able to do otherwise was the only reason that led me to do what it was I did do. And Frankfurt thinks that in cases like that, the person is not morally culpable, right? If you have somebody hold a gun to your head and say, rob the bank, you don't have a choice, right? Unless you want to say you're willing to lose your life, okay, whatever. But a rational person says, I'm going to rob the bank, right, to preserve my life. And Frankfurt wants to say you're not morally responsible in that case. The only reason why you're robbing the bank is because you couldn't do otherwise. So Frankfurt thinks you're off the hook in terms of moral responsibility in a case like that. But Frankfurt says, but that's not what is happening in most cases. When you don't have a gun to your head, the reason why you're doing what you're doing is not only because you couldn't have done otherwise, but because you have these other psychological intentional motivations as well. I want money for my family, etc. And so that's why I'm robbing the bank. Now, Frankfurt thinks it's always the case that you can't do otherwise. He agrees with the determinism, that what you're going to do is in some sense determined. But he thinks that that's not relevant in most cases. In most cases of moral responsibility, we're going to say the reason why you did what you did was because you wanted to do it, or you had these other motivations at play. There are cases of extreme coercion where the only reason why you do what you do is because you were unable to do otherwise. And you're off the hook in those cases, but in most cases, you've got these other reasons that you bring to bear that are motivating your actions. And that's why we hold you responsible in those cases. So moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. You can't have done otherwise. You couldn't have done otherwise, but you had all these other reasons to do what it was you're going to do. And that's what we should care about when we're thinking about moral responsibility. Being unable to do otherwise is always there. That's always going to be a factor in every human action that occurs. They're always determined, but they're not always. It's not always the relevant factor.